My name is Saadiqa Kumanyika, and I consider myself to be a human rights activist, a community builder, an organizer, and an educator. I'm someone who has a lot of experience working in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault. I've done this work in a number of different capacities, including volunteering. I've been doing this stuff since high school. I was also a counselor in a women's shelter. I was the economic justice and empowerment specialist. And I also serve on a couple of boards that work with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. I was born in Staten Island, right? So I lived in New York, lived in Bushwick, in Brooklyn for like the first 7 years of my life, and then we moved to Pennsylvania. So I spent most of my life in Pennsylvania. Some of the most memorable moments of my upbringing would be our family meetings. This is something that we've done for many years, and we still do this. And the family meeting, and this is something my immediate family would do, and it created opportunities for us to have check-ins with each other and to problem solve. So if somebody was acting up, we'd get together and try to figure out what needs to be done to address that particular issue. The other thing would be the discussions that we had growing up. So my family is very close, and I would say my dad, I don't know if he would identify as this, but I think he was somewhat of like a black nationalist. But he was very much, he respected Malcolm X and talked about self-determination and black pride and, the idea that blacks, like, we need to build up our communities and to start up our own businesses. And, so in addition to the conversations about those things, he would also make sure that we knew about our culture and our history. That was, something that was very important to him. I remember him making us watch Roots when I was probably like 9 or 10 years old, right? And that led into a discussion about Africa, and not just that, black people were slaves, or, it's like, there were kings and queens in places like Timbuktu and Mali, right? And to really instill a sense of cultural pride in us. So things like that were very important, very significant, in that it fed my desire to learn more about my culture, and also inspired me as an adult to travel to Africa, right? So as an undergraduate student, I studied abroad at the University of Ghana, and that was a very eye-opening, life-changing experience for me, that has led me to travel to many other places across the continent and other so-called developing countries. It really helped me to see, like, wow, some of the conditions that were affecting black people here in the United States were similar to issues that were affecting black South Africans, or, the Ghanaians, right? I mean, we were both brainwashed or affected by colonization in different ways. I was exposed to the poverty, and it helped me to think about the ways that our struggles were interlinked, and, to ask questions like, how do we, the United States, how does our government perpetuate some of these problems that are very visible in these countries? It's really fed this desire to think about different ways that I can contribute to making change in society. Like, what can I do to address some of the systemic issues, structural issues facing black and brown people in the U.S. and abroad? And currently, one of the ways that I'm working to do that, right, and to contribute in that way, is through my activism with Greenville BLacklivesmatter, which is located in South Carolina. And, as a community builder, as an organizer, one of the things that we are very focused on is really, one, tapping into the needs of the community so that we can come up with different programs and things, because currently many of the current systems aren't working in our favor, right? So if you look at organizations like Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, they have a whole bunch of, like, 20 different co-ops. They have their own food co-ops, their construction co-op, labor co-ops, right? So how can we start to implement some of those things into the Greenville community? So aside from the activism work that I'm engaged in, I'm also currently in the process of preparing for graduate school to get another degree, but another master's degree, but to become a therapist, to become a clinical social worker. And one of the reasons that I want to do that is, having traveled from state to state, protest to protest, every time another, Black person is gunned down by the police, one of the things that I think about a lot of times is trauma in the Black communities. I remember standing in the middle of the street where Mike Brown was murdered and thinking about all those people who had to just see that body, laid there uncovered for 4.5 hours, however long it was, right? What does that do to people, right? And oftentimes it's the most vulnerable, marginalized groups in society that don't have access to the mental health services that they need. Instead, many of them end up getting locked up in jail for things that could be resolved by a counselor, right? Or a therapist or whatever, right? So I want to be able to serve this population through therapy. I want to be able to find ways to make it more accessible so that we have less Black and brown people getting locked up. So those are some of the things that I'm pursuing right now. So protesting has been a way for me to join different communities that have been affected by violence, right? State sanctioned violence, and to help them to put pressure on the state, right? Put pressure on the government, on the police, to actually hold officers accountable in certain situations. But it's a way to put pressure on different groups to take action, right? And it's also a way for me to stand in solidarity with different groups, to be there and sit in the pain with the families that have been affected by different forms of violence. I've been to many different protests, and one of the things that I have experienced, oftentimes when people think about protests, they're like, oh, those protesters are violent, they're rioting, they're angry. But that experience has been very different for me. Usually what I see is it's a place of healing for a lot of folks. When I was in Ferguson, we would go to the Ferguson police station, police department every night. And that was a way for the community to vent. I mean, for many of these communities, the members are powerless in different ways, right? And this was their way to heal and to express their discontent for what was going on, right? There's usually a lot of love in these protest spaces. People are giving out free food, and people are caring for each other, and there's medics out there. And I mean, so that's just a small thing, a small way for me to contribute, right? Just to be there. I think having my physical body there, like a physical presence, means something. But I've recently tried to move beyond the protest space, right? Because protest isn't enough, right? It's something that needs to happen. I think it's important to remember that. So there's definitely a place for protest, but I've kind of moved into trying to become an organizer, because in addition to protest, we need something sustainable, right? We need something that's going to help build the infrastructure of different communities that are affected by injustice, and to kind of keep the momentum going, right? I think I just simply want to be remembered as being a servant of the people.